Hi, everyone. We are here with Harvard Sea Change and Environmental Media Association presenting Emma Talks Real Science. I'm very excited to be here today with Dr. Karestan Koenen and Erica Chidi. We're here to discuss mental health, racial disparities, and environmental justice. So thank you both for being here today. I'm so excited to talk with both of you. And I think probably the best way to jump in is to introduce yourselves.
Sure. Do you want me to start? I can. I'm Karestan, and I'm a professor at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where I study mental health and especially trauma and the effects of psychological trauma on mental health and health across, the life course and across generations.
And I'm Erica Chidi. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Loom. We're a well-being brand that focuses on supporting women around sexual and reproductive health. And I've been a doula and health educator for the past decade. And I also am super focused on topics like trauma and shame, and also trying to center Black women and BIPOC people within a reproductive justice framework, which was why this conversation was so exciting, kind of looking at how all of those different things intersect.
I suppose I should introduce myself. I jumped right in. I'm Kate Bosworth. I am an actress and producer and activist. Part of the reason why I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation is that I produced a movie called Nona that is about human trafficking and sex trafficking, and I do a lot of work in that area. And that really does, the survivors of human trafficking and sex trafficking intersects very much with shame and trauma and everything we're talking about today. So while I am not an expert like these two beautiful ladies, I'm very excited to learn a lot from both of you, as I'm sure everyone watching will be as well. So thank you both for being here. I'll just dive in with the first question. To you, Karestan. You've spent the last 20 years studying how traumas such as violence and disasters affect mental health. Can you tell us a bit about your background and what you're seeing now? And I think, we were talking a little bit before, but perhaps we can kind of start with exactly, the definition of trauma and how that relates to the question, but it's kind of starting from basic.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of trauma, when we think about trauma, we think about something it can be something that's threatening, also usually something that feels out of control and unpredictable and really overwhelms our ability to cope. And so, right now people can experience like the COVID pandemic as trauma, but also the video, for example, of George Floyd being murdered was obviously traumatic for like people close to him and the people who watch, but even people who are now watching that online, because it really involves this feeling of being threatened and really overwhelmed our ability to cope. And it's something I've been studying, like you said, for about 20 years. I started off as a psychologist, and what I really thought I was going to do is work in private practice and treat women who'd experienced sexual violence. And then in graduate school, I got very into research, and I've been mainly doing research for the last 20 years with different communities, from veterans to, and recently a lot on women, studying the effects of trauma on women, their mental health, things like post-traumatic stress disorder, but also their physical health. So like trauma and diabetes and cardiovascular disease, and then also looking at trauma women experience, especially early in life, and how that affects their own children, so across generations.
Karestan, just to that point, I'm so curious, thinking about earlier in life and exploring trauma during that period of time. Could you talk a little bit about ACEs and just the connection between childhood trauma and adult trauma, or like the lived experience there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking about that. ACEs, we are adverse childhood experiences, is sort of the short-term link, the short-term word for it. And they involve things we might think about, like childhood abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, but also neglect, but also other things like financial hardship, having a parent with a mental illness or who's been incarcerated. So there's a wide range of things that are included under adverse childhood experiences. And then what we know about them is that, for example, kids who experience like childhood sexual abuse are at increased risk of other traumas like sexual assault later in life. And then also what we've seen, so one of the cohorts I work in, this cohort of women called the Nurses Health Study, we followed them over 30 years. We've studied the abuse in the women themselves. So women report on their own experiences of abuse and ACEs. And then we follow up their children, and we see increased risk of some things you might expect, like depression, but other things like increased risk of obesity, smoking, drug use. So it's kind of a long answer to your question, but ACEs have an impact on the person who experiences them, but they also have these ripple effects across generations.
And I think, what's interesting about ACEs is most people don't know that scale or even just that concept exists. And, I'm curious, and maybe Kate, just like from a personal perspective, if this even feels interesting, Karestan, do you think there is value in what is already such an overwhelming time that is for some very much, they're having an experience of present trauma through COVID, through quarantining, to explore something like ACEs, looking back at childhood, getting a framework potentially of like what you did experience to maybe understand how to potentially safeguard or take care of yourself like during this current time? I'm always like curious, like, is it worth opening Pandora's box when you're already inside of something that's so intense?
Right. That's a great question. I don't know, Kate, did you want to jump in?
I mean, I found my time during the pandemic, just from a personal point of view, I found a lot of desire to move inward and to do a lot of work. Obviously, this is like a totally, personal answer and not having to do with like an enormous amount of trauma, but the things that I had been kind of not wanting to deal with or sort of suppressing, very much came to the surface. I think anytime anybody has a lot of time to not distract themselves really, and to sort of sit with themselves and to sit with your thoughts is very confronting. And I found that, a lot of things were coming up for me that I hadn't really dealt with, definitely things like from long-term things, that I hadn't wanted to deal with. And I'm someone who's, been through counseling, been through therapy, and have really kind of tried to, heal from a lot of things. But this was a moment where I think everything slowed down quite a bit. And I think because we live in a society that is so fast-paced and so distracting, that this was kind of a moment where everyone just stopped and was able to just be kind of idle. And it is interesting to think about what, if people wanted to kind of look at themselves and look at the sort of issues that they're dealing with. I definitely felt like a lot of my own mental health was real up and down during this whole pandemic. Like right out of the gate, I felt super strong and kind of like, oh, the world slowed down, I'm able to really like move inward. And I was very sort of optimistic and hopeful about it. I think that's inherently in my nature. But then as time kind of went on, and I think one of the things that's most confronting is this kind of fear of the unknown. You know what I mean? And I think this kind of like unknowing, when is this going to end? How long is this going to go on for? The sort of lack of leadership in, any kind of government positions at the moment of like what's happening, what are the statistics, how can we come together as a community? It feels very isolated is the word, and so I think that like for me, I felt very sort of optimistic, like I'm going to handle this, you know, as well as possible. And then just sort of started having like real, kind of like waves of anxiety and, you know, not really knowing what to do with myself. And I think a lot of that comes from the fear of the unknown. And that's a real trigger for me anyway. So when I'm sort of sitting in something, you know, so overwhelming and as what's happening currently, it's definitely been something to, you know, something to try and figure out. But ultimately, I mean, Erica, sorry, I'm like totally jumping randomly, but like your video that you posted recently, that I reposted, which was talking about, you know, that one hit me because I was having a particularly like difficult time.
Yeah.
And you kind of, you talked about like everything that was going on at the moment. You know, this sort of stillness that we're having in the pandemic. And I think it was kind of right as, you know, Black Lives Matter was having like their first like big kind of uprising in this particular moment. And you had talked about the importance of shame and sort of understanding what shame is and sort of unpacking that and how that relates to mental health. Like that video hit me just right in that moment, you know?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, you know, that video definitely impacted a lot of people. And I think it all ties into kind of what I was alluding to in my last kind of comment, in the sense that, you know, deep anti-racism work is a confrontation with the fiber of your being. And most people's like inner core has a lot of shame, and shame is very uncomfortable, especially in a kind of culture that prizes perfection. And so a lot of people, when they are having their awakening around this concept of anti-racism, now say someone that's maybe in their 30s or 40s is like, oh, for the past like 25, 30 years, I've been failing at something. And so, you know, when you have to interact with that, you know, that it's a very destabilizing experience. And so for me, when I was seeing all of these conversations around like, you need to do the work and like, here's what you need to do, those are all key, but this work is lifelong. And to do it, you have to come in contact with deep pain and trauma. And that's, for some people, to be perfectly frank, will not be a long-term possibility. It's too hard. And there'll be people who are too, you know, crystallized, calcified as an individual to really be able to get down to the core of the work, which is why, you know, when we initially were talking about the adverse childhood experiences concept or scale, you know, and one of the reasons why I was asking, is it worth going back to childhood to get like an understanding of like, okay, here's actually where I've always sat around trauma. Here's what I'm currently facing around trauma, and see if there's a story that can be told between the two that somehow allows room for you, if you are a white person, to deal with or better metabolize the anti-racism work. And then for, say, myself as a Black, you know, woman, be able to be like, okay, I have had a really tough experience as a child. This is a really tough experience right now as an adult. And then figure out like, what is my dosage of this work that I can even do? Or what is the dosage of like the self-care I need to do to be able to even manage what's going on? So it's like, it's not the trauma Olympics, you know, but there is, you know what I mean? But there is a scale, there is an algorithm. Like I'm always just thinking, how do we, there's some math here that can help support how out of control and overwhelming a lot of this is. And yeah, I'm just so curious, Karestan, like what you think about all of that, between Kate's personal experience with the pandemic and like my own kind of, and I haven't really talked too much about my personal experience. And maybe the only thing I'll throw out there too in listening to Kate that I really took in. And I think it's, one of the things I often say is I really think that productivity or output is a culturally supported trauma response. So when things go wrong for me, or I feel super activated, or my trauma kicks in, I typically go into rev, like what can I do? How do I do it? How can I get it really good? Because, that's my like drug of choice per se, right? Or like my acting out behavior. But in our culture, like nobody is going to say to you, like, don't work, So you can hide out really well there. But I think during the pandemic, a lot of those hideout, culturally okay hideout places have kind of evaporated. So, I think there's been other ways that my kind of trauma, has been coming forward that actually remind me a lot of being a child when I didn't have a lot of the kind of adult skills of like work to help me work things out. There were other ways that the trauma was like showing up in my body, which I'm getting reacquainted with right now. So again, long way of explaining it, but I'm, Karestan, so curious about your thoughts.
Wow, I feel like my head is exploding, so I'll try to, and also I'm resonating a lot because I would say I'm a planner and a producer. Those are my drugs of choice. And I also responded originally with the pandemic. I'm like, oh, there's a million things I'm gonna do. It's gonna, at work, there's house projects. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna learn new piano, like all this. And then lately I've been feeling really more defeated, like, wow, this is still happening and things are getting worse. So and not being able to plan is really challenging for me. So, but I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, one, Erica, you're talking about your people going back to adverse childhood experiences and whether it's worth even going there. And I think where it can be in dosage is that, that we all, many people, almost everyone has some adversity in their childhood. I mean, there's definitely a huge range. And by understanding that, it can help us understand our reactions now. And often the way we learn to cope and things that we do now are often we learn because they functioned back then. And so I think understanding some of that can at least bring us some compassion for ourselves. And I think self-compassion is a major antidote for shame. And the other piece that, I mean, there's so many things both of you said that resonated. The other piece that resonated is we had a session at Harvard on racism as a trauma. And one of the things the woman named Jessica Presti spoke, and she said that really hit home was that racism, all racism, structural racism, doing anti-racism work, you have to sit with these really difficult feelings. And one of our main ways, most of us as individuals, but as a culture, we deal with trauma is to avoid. Mm-hmm. And plunging into action can be a way of avoiding the inner work and the feelings. And some of that, I think for, different, other white people is like judging each other and, who's going to be the most sort of active. And that's not to say there isn't a lot of action that needs to be done, but it sort of can be a way of avoiding some of the inner work, I think, as well. That's necessary for long term. And then another piece you said about, you said earlier, I think when we were talking, but about ACEs, and is this sort of understanding what the vulnerabilities you bring to the situation so that you can also do the things you need to take care of yourself and keep yourself sort of together and resilient for the long road ahead. And I think for myself, where this has really hit home now is I have a 13-year-old son, and I've really been kind of seeing a lot of myself as that age, like because I see him at that age and the things that kids struggle with. And so I've been relating a lot to this as sort of a mom and, kind of revisiting my middle school, which is something no one I think wants to revisit through his eyes. So talk about, trauma. And then also, I mean, this is now I'm got a little tangent, but going off and thinking about what's hit me when I saw the George Floyd video. I mean, the thing this is really hitting me as a mother this time in a different way than previously. And I don't know if it's the pandemic also, because we're home, he and I are home together all the time. But I've been struck with the weight of the fact that my son's white, so I don't worry about certain things that if I had a Black son, I would worry about. But also then I feel this big sort of responsibility to educate him, to make sure, like, what should I be teaching him as a like emerging white male, and then all that's happening in a pandemic when schools are shut and it seems like options are limited and what can you do. So that's a kind of rambly, but you can redirect me to whatever in there. But there's just, yeah, there's a lot I'm relating to.
Well, can we talk about, because I know we sort of discussed this before, but can we talk about like what is shame?
Yes, it's good.
Like what is it? Because I feel like sometimes, like, when you think about shame, you think about humiliation or guilt or embarrassment, but shame at the core is what?
Shame at the core. I mean, at the core, it's this sort of, I don't know, it's this deep sort of negative sense of self, or negative evaluation, or almost at the point, I mean, maybe self-hatred is too strong, but this just really deep sense of you're not worthy, you're not enough, I'm not worthy, and sort of nothing can make it better. I think and shame is something we avoid, as Erica said. We're a culture of sort of like perfection and doing, and some of that can be motivated by shame. I know, in my own life, some of that is like do more and more and more, achieve more, so that I don't have to sort of sit with that.
Yeah.
And I kind of keeping with that idea, something that's coming forward for me, around this triangle of or triangulation of shame and trauma and work. Karestan, I'm so curious if there's something in the middle of that triangulation that you touched on, self-compassion, but are there other tools, other things that can be used to kind of help offset that triangulation from time to time, especially,
that's a good question.
Right? Like, to make, and it's not necessarily about making space, but I think it's about, I use the word metabolizing a lot, but it's like, or maybe a better word is modulate. Like, how do you modulate between, just kind of based on this conversation, it seems like trauma, shame, work. Like, and when it's work, it's like work of, being with those two pieces, and also just the work of being alive at this time that is so inverse to anything any of us have ever experienced. What are some accessible tools? Like, how do you even develop self-compassion? Like, where does that come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'd love to hear both of your answers, because it's not like I can say some things I suggest. So one thing that I have found very powerful, and people can find very powerful, is I've used this with clients who are dealing with childhood trauma histories or adversity histories, is one thing is if you have the opportunity to observe kids the age that when you had a certain experience, especially one that you're very ashamed of. So if it was some experience that's coming back to you, for example, friend was talking about a way she behaved towards another kid when she was in middle school. She was like 11 and she did something that was, it was really mean, but she was 11 years old. And then she looked at 11-year-olds. I mean, now she couldn't, we can't go outside as much. So she watched a film, there was 11, and she saw, wow, they're so young. And so that is one way of developing self-compassion, because we judge ourselves by where we are and everything we know now. So I'm 52. So then I judge myself on how I behaved when I was 18 by the knowledge of a 52-year-old woman, not an 18-year-old. So that's one thing. Something else is I have found really helpful is you know, whether it's through movies or reading or whatever, about different people's life stories that have had some arc of from a negative place to a positive place. And so that can be really sort of helpful, because you can see that if you, even some people you admire, if you learn more about them, you can see that they struggled, that they weren't born, you know, they weren't born, think of any great activist, likely wasn't born, you know, perfect, you know, as a 20-year-old, and, you know, had flaws. So I think that's something else. And then I think that the other thing I think is really important right now is also to do things that bring you joy, that it's not being selfish to have fun and have joy. It's actually sort of, you think about like filling the tank. If you're doing all this work, you're dealing with trauma, you're doing anti-racism work, and you're dealing with shame, you need to find some things that make you feel good and bring you joy, whatever those are. So that could be with someone else, it could be simple things, you know, but don't neglect the joy just to do the work, if that makes any sense.
Completely. I think, you know, that makes so much sense hearing that. And one thing I maybe wanted to kind of throw out there on top of that is, and thinking also about shame, is what about the biomedical model? You know, where does medication management, you know, come into the conversation here? Because I think that is something that is super stigmatized. And I think because our environment is so overwhelming right now, and also is so novel, honestly, no one has been here before, you know, what does it look like to potentially, you know, talk about SSRIs or psychiatric support? Like, I just, because for some people, trying to even access or find joyful things to do, the same things that potentially brought pleasure 6 months ago just aren't hitting it right now. And
or you can't do them. So yeah, right.
Do them. And so, you know, yeah, I don't really I can't totally articulate this question fully, but I'm just so curious, especially maybe with your previous work, Karestan, like where does medication come in, and how can it, and what does it look like to potentially have that be a part of your self-care plan so that you can access joy or do things that can bring that to you?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I'm glad you brought it up, because you're right, medication, there's many things I can talk about, many tools, mindfulness, you know, there's exercise, there's all kinds of great apps, but medication is something that is part of our toolbox that we can use at different times. And there's different kinds of medications. You had mentioned SSRIs, which are things like people might be familiar with, like the Prozac or Paxil or Zoloft. And they're often taken for if you're feeling depressed or anxious in a way that's sort of persistent. And you hit on one of the key, when people say, well, how do I know if I'm just, you know, things are crappy, so I feel crappy, versus something where I might want to talk to a professional, or might want medication or sort of more formal therapy. And you hit on one of the signs is that if you can't find joy in things that you used to find joy in. So now a lot of things are cut off to us, but if there were things that, reading a book or listening to music, and even those things that you can do that normally would have made you happy, if you're not, that would be one sign that maybe you're feeling more depressed. And something like cognitive behavioral therapy and or medication would be something you might look into. And then also for people, if you're very anxious, which a lot of people are right now, those same medications can be effective for anxiety, and they're not quote unquote addicting. And then there's many others. There's also other medications that can help people sleep. But I do think that, medication is something I've used at different points in my life. And something that people also ask is like, if you go on, it means you can never go off it. That's not true. You can go on for a period. It takes time to work, but you can go on and then taper at some point and go off it. So those are all things that people can consider, but I would encourage people to consider it as part of like a toolbox of things they could use. And probably better than drinking a lot, which most of us are also doing right now. So, and many other things that we might be trying to make ourselves feel better.
I think that's helpful to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Kate.
Please, no, I was going to take a little bit of I was going to jump in another way. So please finish.
I think just to wrap up that piece, it's so helpful to hear that articulated, because seeing medication management as a part of your toolbox that can start at one point and end at one point, I think is helpful, especially I think for Black people, because I think definitely in our community and our culture, taking medication is very stigmatized, and there is a deep push to look at faith-based tools, or food or other things as a way to kind of mitigate what you're feeling or to manage what you're feeling, and not look at that as an option because people feel like they'll get on it and they can't get off, and those pieces. And, I think just moving to like the top of our conversation around, racial disparities and just in the environment that you're living in, I think Black people, Black women specifically, are much more susceptible to a lot of these kind of issues around trauma that we're talking about that have a direct impact on our lifespan and our quality of life. And so I just think any tools that can be used need to be brought to light and have that stigma removed in order to make sure we have like every opportunity to live a full life. And to that, I mean, Karestan, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about weathering,
Sure.
I think that really is one of the reasons why I brought up medication and just wanted the full toolbox to be in the discussion because of this concept.
Right. So, sure. Yeah. I was glad you brought up weathering before when we spoke as well. So when we think of weathering, it's in terms of what you're talking about, in terms of Black women or stress, we think about the effects of sort of all the disadvantage that a person's experienced in her life. So that can be, whether it's being, growing up poor, experiencing abuse, having a parent who's incarcerated or a mentally ill parent, all those things, but also in prior generations, as we learn more about what we pass down to our children, it's, we pass down our genes, but we also, there's more and more evidence we pass down some of our experiences. And those effects impact, for example, are credited with one of the reasons that even if you look at Black and white women of the same level of education, sort of like high education, the Black women have much higher rate of adverse outcomes when they have babies, like low birth weight babies, for example. So even if Black women get the same level of education, we still see these effects, and weathering is thought to be is one of the reasons for that. And what I was really, and I love the way I love this idea to look at weathering not as some kind of like curse, like, oh God, now there's weathering, but as something that then you recognize. And so how do you counteract the effects of that? And what are all the tools that one can have or avail oneself of? It's a much more empowering view than I've heard presented before. So I think that's really actually encouraging for me to think about it, and how I present, also when I present that in the future, how I will think about presenting it, because it's important, I think, for people to know, just like for ACEs, for people to know, so that then they can figure out, okay, this is what I have. So then what can I do with, what can I do for myself?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Erica, you're so incredible. Like the work that you do, and like from how long I've known you, like you have so much knowledge and you educate so beautifully, but it's also through a lens of like, how do we grow? How are we better as a society? It's with a lot of hope. And I don't know, I just felt like it was really important to say that, just knowing you. I think like you're such an incredible person in the world that way.
Thank you. I really appreciate it so much, especially right now when, I'm quarantining alone, and, you can really get inside of your own head and just be like, what is my impact? I don't know. Anything that's valuable. But actually, I'm so glad that you touched on the topic of hope, because it just popped into my mind to maybe just talk about post-traumatic growth. I don't have a ton of exposure to that concept, but when I did find out about it, I was like, post-traumatic growth seems like I don't know, maybe the threshold or the fulcrum to resilience, or like, I don't know, one way or the other, because I think, I just feel like words are so important. And sometimes, a word that's been used for such a long time sometimes loses its meaning. Like even the word hope right now, it's hard to like hold it, it just kind of wants to evaporate. But this idea of post-traumatic growth, for some reason, has really just been like hitting like in my physical body in this really supportive way. And I don't know a lot about it. I'm really curious, Karestan, what you think about it. Kate, if you've heard about it, because I do feel like it's something that maybe people need to hear about right now, that like this is an awful time, but there's something like growing and changing inside of us as it's happening.
I've never heard that term, but what I'm taking from you is that it's literally like one who's evolving from trauma and growing from that difficult or challenging experience. But that's my guess, because I don't know. Am I right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And it's something that I'm glad you brought up the concept, because people like me, we neglect it sometimes, because one thing about the biomedical model is that we tend to focus on the illness and the sort of bad stuff, but we're not so good at studying growth, resilience, sort of positive, and it can come off as sort of hokey, like, but it is the idea that out of trauma and pain there can be positive outcomes, or the sort of positive changes people make. And there's a whole area of post-traumatic growth research. There's scales that people use and trying to measure this. And one thing that I found really interesting is that when people measure post-traumatic growth, it doesn't seem like people will show high post-traumatic growth and they still may have depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's not like if you grow, you're not going to feel bad, or you're not going to feel any pain. It's more like you can feel the two together. And that's always resonated with me, because certainly some of the most painful experiences of my life, when I look back, I will see a lot of growth, but it didn't come without a lot of pain and challenge. And it sort of makes me think about, I guess I feel like Erica's the hope giver today, because when I think about also all the things we're experiencing as a country, maybe the hope is that there is so much pain that is coming to light, that people are feeling ability to express now, or the opportunity to express. But out of that, there will be, when hope's growth and change. So I think that is a really powerful concept right now that people should hear about.
Well, I was going to jump in and say that just from my own personal experiences and sort of my own interest in shame and growth and pain, and how that's all kind of like interconnected, is that the only way that I've been able to kind of overcome my own shame, and I've been dealing with a lot of that recently, is to connect with another person that I have discerned as a safe person to be vulnerable with. Like, for me, the connectivity of vulnerability and shame and pain is so important, because in my own personal experience, like, that's the only thing that's been able to lead to growth and healing, is to kind of really sit with my own vulnerability. And like, I'll put my hand up here and say that, like, I will like kick and scream from vulnerability like all day long. I find it so confronting and so hard. But the thing that sort of eclipses my, like, sort of distaste for vulnerability is I have such and sort of an innate desire to grow and be better. You know what I mean? So it's like that will eclipse like, ooh, I don't want to feel vulnerable, but I do want to grow and be better, you know? So I've tried in my adult life to really like lean into vulnerability, even though it's like so hard, and to sort of start extracting like, well, why is it so hard? Why is it so difficult to be vulnerable? You know, and to then start to communicate that with people who I discern to be safe to be vulnerable with, because obviously, you know, it would be a disservice to kind of move out with just anybody and say like, I'm vulnerable. You know, it's you have to really feel, you know, that the person who you're being vulnerable with will hold you in that safe space, you know? And for me, the kind of combination of like vulnerability and shame and healing and growth and pain, like are kind of all interconnected. And I feel like this is, I don't know, I suppose if I think about myself as the micro and I look at the world as the macro, like I'm seeing so much of that right now and observing that. And I just wondered what you both thought of that.
I mean, I think the vulnerability piece is so important and so powerful. And I think, again, going back to this idea of dosage, or maybe dosage and delivery system at the same time, I think the one-to-one is like a really great delivery system or like relationship to have to explore vulnerability, because you still have some containment, you know, and then deciding like how frequently and how often you want to do that. I think one of the most kind of powerful things I've done in quarantine is I have a one-on-one book club with a very close friend, where we're kind of, yeah, just one-on-one, and we do like an hour a week, sometimes a half an hour, depends, again, the dosage piece just depends on how we're feeling. And that's been really powerful. It's a text that's all about like, it's a self-help book. But it's allowed us to really like dive in and not kind of deal with, you know, some of the stickiness or the kind of, you know, ability to maybe opt out that can happen when you're in a larger group, like in a book club. So that I really think is just a great way to kind of develop that vulnerability piece safely. At the same time, I do think that, you know, social media does have its functionality around, you know, it is helpful now to see more people on different platforms talking about feelings and emotions, because I think it is the thing that is going to set us free. I mean, I think, Karestan, you were talking about it a couple moments ago around with post-traumatic growth, the people who show high post-traumatic growth still have PTSD, still have depression and anxiety. And so I think, you know, culturally, what we have done a really poor job of is highlighting, holding two things at the same time. Yeah. The fact that you can have what might be classified as dysfunction, but still be a high performance person at the same time. Those don't get to have a lot of space together. And so, you know, I can't help but find some excitement around people talking about their pain and vulnerability, but still being in the world and participating in a way that our culture has valued for such a long time. And that kind of broken but operating place is very much like the Black experience for me. Like that is it. It's like you figure something out, call it resilience, call it faith, call it whatever it is, but you're operating, but you're broken because the system has put you in that position. And so, you know, I think for me, I've just been trying to figure out a way to, you know, navigate those things and have conversations about them, both in the macro, to Kate's point, like on social media where it feels appropriate, and then in the micro, kind of in these smaller, you know, environments to, you know, over time be able to find some kind of comfort that doesn't look like I get to be happy all the time. It just you know, just everybody there's light everywhere. And by light, I don't mean like a bright light. I mean just like a flashlight. Like we can see all the different parts inside of ourselves, you know?
Yeah, I actually think, because Erica, some of the things that you and I talk about like often in this space is sustainability. And I think like it's so important to just, I don't know, I just feel like I wanted to dive in with that, because like, as someone, and I think probably everyone actually here in this conversation are people who are we want to dive in, we want to do the work, we want to be better. And then like, I'm sure in my own life, I know I've experienced burnout, which is how then I, you know, try and have more self-care for myself so that I don't burn out, so that I can have more sustainability in my activism and my work and my relationships. Like I know that I'm someone who is trying to find that, like the balance, you know what I mean? Of kind of like doing, I don't know if I'm articulating this so well, but sort of like outputting and then also making sure that I'm filling up my own take so that I can continue the sustainability of outputting in a way that I feel is important. And I'm curious to know, like, and Erica, you know, we talk about the importance of sustainability within this movement right now. And like, I suppose I just wanted to kind of throw that out there and sort of get your thoughts on that in terms of like mental health, in terms of what's happening right now, in terms of, you know, everything that's kind of crossing over in this space. But I think what we all would want to have happen and would strive to have happen is the sustainability of what's happening right now. But in realistically, I think, Erica, we talk about that a lot.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think I want to throw this to Karestan, because I think there's probably a couple things both Kate and I have said over the past couple minutes that, you know, that you've seen in your work and have some thoughts around, from whether it's sustainability or just being able to hold, you know, both the broken and the operating, you know, together, you know, over time. Like what does all of that look like?
Wow, you guys have some big questions.
No.
Yeah, no, right. And it's something I've struggled with personally, so I can speak to my work too, is I go, and then I like have to shut out everything. And it's not, you know, again, when you have a child, or it's not a great model, because people still, all of a sudden, then I disappear. So, so I mean, a couple things resonated in terms of sustainability. I think you both hit on something that's critically important, and I have a question for you on that, and that is like finding that connection with someone else you can be vulnerable. Because one of the main things that keeps anything sustainable, and when we look in research in terms of disasters, you know, in the past, like say Hurricane Katrina or the 9/11 terrorist attacks, these big things the US has experienced, is that something, the social support and social connection is one of the most important factors for people doing well over time. And so one of the questions I had for you is, how do you identify or know the people that you can be vulnerable with? Because that's a question that people often ask me. They say, you know, you want that connection, but I think especially sometimes for younger people, it's hard to know who those people are. And I can say, so for my own, I often have to look at myself and say, if I want, like, I have something I want to share, you know, what are my expectations when sharing it? And, you know, has that person been supportive in the past? Or, but I'm wondering what your both of your experiences. I'm happy to get back to some of the other points too, but I know with maybe, I don't know, with Kate, like, how do you know that's like, there's some that you can be vulnerable with that person? And when you take that risk, I mean, you don't know until you take the risk, but.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think to your point, it comes, for me at least, it's through experience and longevity with a person. Sometimes, you know, I mean, I know this is kind of, it's difficult to kind of throw this like word out there because it's not like rooted in facts, but intuition, you know, like to just literally feel safe with someone else, that can obviously, like, you hope that person will hold you safely in that space. But I would say that, you know, to have a relationship with someone or a friendship with someone where you see them show up in ways that you need them to, I found, because I'm the kind of person that is not so readily vulnerable with people, I found that what worked for me was to put it right up front. For example, with someone who I had discerned that I could be safe with, to say, I'm feeling really vulnerable at the moment, and I would like to share something with you, you know, but to really put it up front, and to not try and sort of, well, what I would do is sort of dance around it, but to really say, I'm feeling so vulnerable. Honestly, like, the majority of the time, the people who have chosen to be vulnerable with will say, oh, tell me what's happening. And, you know, they'll immediately kind of take me into that space. So what's worked in my life is to kind of put that up front. When it's backfired, you sort of realize, okay, well, that's someone who perhaps I won't share that space with in the future, or I'll perhaps think about the timing of it or the different factors that may come into it. But yeah, I mean, for me at least, it's to kind of own how I'm feeling, and that actually helps me dive into it as well. To say, I'm going to, you know, admit that this is how I'm feeling, and by the way, and it's not easy for me to be vulnerable, so please be delicate with me. I'm struggling right now, you know, to kind of verbally have these words that will allow someone to understand where you are. That at least in my experience has been helpful. You know, I don't know, Erica, if you've.
Yeah, I think for me, you know, there's maybe two parts to it, and just in an attempt to keep it simple. I think on the one end, just as a mammal, as a human, I'm always really thinking about how am I feeling in my physical body. You know, what is my kind of animal sense when I am with another person? Like, you know, do I feel really tight, you know, in my chest or in my pelvic floor or in my jaw? Like, what's happening? Because there's typically something happening. And so just trying to have enough space to kind of pay attention to it. And then, you know, and as many people are kind of seeing around this, you know, this resurgence of Black Lives Matter, and then this work around anti-racism and all of that, is there is value in circling up or creating vulnerability within your own group of people. So when I'm with another Black woman who looks like me, who has maybe had some of the same lived experiences that I've had, that I might not even know about, but I will know because we look the same, there also is a sense of kind of immediate safety that might not be present if I'm interacting with someone who looks different to me. And it's definitely a concept that I know is being explored a lot in healthcare around kind of cultural competency versus cultural congruence, which are two kind of like lofty terms to just basically say, like, competence is a white person with a lot of empathy and a lot of research and understanding trying to provide care to someone who does not look like them or come from the same background, and just doing their absolute best. And then congruency being a Black person or BIPOC person providing care to another BIPOC person, being able to navigate those experiences or give them care with that idea of lived experience kind of being at play. So, you know, those are probably like my two things, is just how do I feel in my body? And then really looking for someone that looks like me to have some of these conversations is kind of my piece.
Can I ask one question, Erica? How do you create space? Like, just so, I don't know if anyone's watched, like, because I was like, I want to know how to do that. Like, how do you, this is in terms of, so the question was like, you know, how do you, you know, when you're vulnerable, when, you know, how can you listen to yourself? And you said, you know, I instinctually sort of feel how I am in my physical, and then I kind of create space for myself. Because I know what you mean in terms of, I listen to myself physically, because I can think to myself, oh, I'm feeling really tight in my chest, my stomach is this, and I know I'm just feeling almost like fight or flight that way, and that makes me feel vulnerable, because I'm like, oh, I don't really know if I can even communicate properly, and it just makes me almost shut down. How do you create the space physically to sort of calm that?
Well, you know, it's a work in progress. I don't really have a clear like process for how that happens. But what I will say, again, tying it back to earlier in the conversation around ACEs and having adverse childhood experiences myself, I think one of my immediate adaptation skills was like, how do I survive this situation? And so as a result, one of the tools in my toolbox is constant scanning for threat. And if I feel it, how do I quickly like adapt in my own body to protect myself from it? So, you know, and to your point, Kate, you know, how do I like kind of find some calm or get organized around it? Getting organized when you feel threatened is a survival mechanism. So I think over time, I've just, you know, it's like they always say, there's this idea of like forged in fire. It's like I've figured out a way to take that scanning for threat skill and then be able to kind of distill it into something that can be very positive when it's in the right, you know, situation. Because I think, you know, when you live in a Black body, you're like triple, quadruple scanning for threat all the time. That's a big idea of what the weathering component is about, is like always thinking about, okay, am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? At a different level than people that live in white bodies, because the framework is set up to support your survival and your existence, and it's set up for you to thrive. So you're not having to sit at the scan level that I'm having to sit at. So I think, you know, I think when you get very good at scanning, then you're scanning up levels and it starts to do different things, which is why I think a lot of Black women, Black people are really good space holders, because we've had to adapt from this, you know, from this preservation place to then now this kind of like public communing place. There's something there. Again, it's like, it's not something I've given like a lot of thought to, but just in this conversation, it's like, why is it that we are able to maybe do that? Or that's something that a lot of us that maybe are invisible positions have built our lives around, like making space for people to navigate different things. But I do feel like it has a base of like, it comes from a base of pain or a skill that that had to be learned. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking, Erica, you've just illustrated brilliantly in terms of going back to the beginning of the conversation on the power of understanding your own experience and how understanding your history and how you adapted influences how it helps you understand how you react today and then take care of yourself and also build that space. It connects everything. And I think that one of the other pieces you hit on in terms of trauma is when you talked about living in a Black body, is that the sort of racism as a unique, and when we think about trauma in the sense that it doesn't stop. So normally if I'm like treating someone who's been traumatized, back when I did clinical work, they had a trauma. It could have been horrible. It could have been being kidnapped, you know, really the stuff that Kate's movie's about. But if the trauma is done and now they're safe. But it's almost learning to live with the trauma, because it's not something you can just put in the past and that's done and now I'm in the present. And so that's something that
that's really powerful. I'm so glad that you said that, because yeah, there's the intergenerational trauma of racism, but then it's constant. It actually has not gone anywhere. And so, you know, that's it's really powerful just to hear it put that way.
This is like such a like we could so much for all of us to
I know.
I had something I want, if it's okay if I just like kind of pivot to something.
Sure.
It's something that Karestan, you and I touched on, like on a conversation that we'd had. And this sort of brings in a few things, because obviously, you know, Real Science, you know, has so many different things that they cover. But this sort of, okay, so I'm just gonna throw it out there. So it's climate change. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna really pivot here, but it's gonna come back to everything else. To discuss the psychology, how do we act on something that has a known future impact, but no tangible or visible current impact? So I'm going to throw that question out there, and then I'm going to also add this. Something that you and I, Karestan, had talked about was this idea of a reactionary society that we live in, reacting to things that we see versus things that we don't see. And I feel like I am seeing that so much now, whether it's, you know, the video of George Floyd being murdered. We happen to be in a moment of a pandemic where everyone's sitting still looking at this video and having time to not rush to work or go to a movie or go to everyone was just had this moment of sort of immobility to sit and watch and take in this horror. Though we know this happens as a society. We know that, we hear this, we hear about police brutality, we hear about, Black bodies being murdered in the streets from police. But this particular video in this particular time was something that we actually saw. Mm-hmm. And I just, in thinking about sort of, and again, I know it's a kind of a weird, crazy like jump of like climate change and, talking about George Floyd, but I guess what I'm asking is, as a society, like, do we have to see things in order to react? Is that like innately built into us? Because I know when we spoke before and you were talking about human trafficking and you said, I wonder if someone saw a video that was as traumatizing as something like the George Floyd video of people who have been human trafficked, like, would you have more of a reaction? And I guess, like, I know it's a sort of a weird, big conversational point, but I just wondered, as a reactionary society, is there something there to discuss in terms of seen versus unseen, knowing versus seeing, Yeah, because obviously,
That's a great question. I can't say, that's a huge question, but you hit on one of the biggest, I think, challenges with climate change is that I can cite its effects, its intellectual effects, but knowing all of that, has, it may change my behavior in little bitty ways, but has it changed it in massive and large ways? Or, and I think that is, I think that's really there's clearly something powerful with seeing, with seeing and hearing, seeing this and hearing the personal stories. So with George Floyd being murdered, seeing it and then hearing him cry out for his mother, and then hearing from his family and his and hearing all the people's personal experiences around that. And I think about that with your film or the Me Too movement. It's about personal stories and and so there is something about, I think it's seeing it, but then there's also something about people needing to connect personally in that real emotional way that is motivating. And how to do that around, I think so many things with climate change seems abstract. I would love to, the other big piece that comes to mind, I'd love to hear what Erica has to say about this is, we had also talked about environmental justice, and in terms of the anti-racism, expanding that conversation to think about the ways that certain communities, Black communities, but Native American communities, other communities are impacted disproportionately by climate change in terms of air pollution, and even things like where there's flooding or hurricanes, or there's disasters that might affect everyone but disproportionately affect certain groups in clean water, or other, like Flint, but other places where that's an issue. So I don't know, I feel like I'm rambling a bit, so maybe Erica will have the answer. I don't have a way of cutting through it.
I don't have an answer per se, but I think this might be a great place potentially for us to kind of close the conversation around, in the sense that as much as we are really pushing towards bigger kind of foundational issues like abolitionism and defunding the police and getting people to vote. I think the conversations that also need to be happening, and again, as people are trying to figure out their lane in this resistance or revolution, for some it will be defund the police, abolitionism. For some it will be mental health and increasing awareness and access around that, especially in BIPOC communities. And then for some it will be environmental justice, which is a big piece. And really trying to have more awareness campaigns around, what not having clean water does, whether it's in Flint or it's in LA. There are pockets of this type of environmental disparity or inequity throughout the country, and understanding that, really high air pollution can lead to a high increase in stillbirths. Like there's just, every single sector has its own problems that need to be solved. And with Loom and within my work, my lane is reproductive justice. I'm really concerned around how systemic racism has really removed the ability for Black women particularly, and also Latinx women, or people that have those parts and might not even identify as women, to have easy access to good sexual and reproductive health care. And that is in its own way, its own platform. So I think really understanding that there's so many places to sit in this uprising, and it just depends on really what moves you. Because for some people, they might be moved by abolitionism and that's what they want to do, but there's some people who are more moved by environmental issues and that's where they want to be. So there's no right way to navigate this time. It's actually, and that's why I think a lot of the reactionary kind of outpouring around this beginning of, for some people, the beginning of this movement, it serves a purpose, but going back to the sustainability, it's really going to be about where do you want to sit and what work do you want to do and what's going to continue to motivate you. Because for some people, their motivation kind of factors are going to look different. So there's just room. And I think that's going to just take some time and reflection for people to really figure out. But I think it's just important to kind of talk about that.
Yeah, and how I think we, the importance of impacting future generations. That's the thing that's, in thinking about, something like climate change, knowing the damage that the future generations are going to inherit. Like, what can we do now? And I think that's a really important point, Erica, to really think about, aligning yourself in areas that really matter to you, and really, I do think it's so important to talk about, sustainability and mental health within yourself. I think, you spoke of it so eloquently and beautifully in your video. And that's why it hit me so hard, because I think, there's so many people in the world who are wanting to do good and wanting to be a part of important change. And yet, if you don't check in with yourself and make sure that you are taking care of your own mental health, it's almost impossible for sustainability. I think that's what you said so beautifully, Erica.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, and Karestan, I'm interested to hear your thoughts kind of too, kind of wrapping things. I just think that there's racial disparity in every sector of society. So you can really just pick your lane and go for it, but I think to the idea of this, of mental health and trauma, just making sure that those two pieces are kind of at the forefront. Because right now I think they're kind of like the caboose. And if we don't really reorganize the train and kind of put it in the front, nothing really will stick, fortunately or unfortunately. And I think that maybe some people want to hear that, maybe some people don't want to hear that, but I do just feel like we have to center so much of this around mental health and the observation and inclusion of trauma in the conversation.
Right. Yeah. And what I come back to is that I think you're right. We think of even, you know, our whole medical system is set up to sort of, if you have a mental health issue, you go to, you know, you go to a psychiatrist, you go to someone who deals with your brain. And, but then if anything else, you go with someone who deals with the rest of your body. Like there's these separate things. And what I'm hopeful about with everything that's going on is that all these conversations about mental health will bring it to the fore in the sense that it's really the foundation of everything, the foundation of all health. And we know that it's a foundation of physical health, and that people need to take care of their own mental health and well-being beyond, you know, not just preventing depression or PTSD, but to feel good mentally and you know, hopeful. They need to sustain themselves in order to, you know, in order to contribute, in order to perpetuate whatever their lane is, in order to make a difference in the world. At some point, if you're not sustaining yourself and your well-being, and then you are going to burn out, and you're not going to be able to continue to contribute. And I think that all the work you've been doing, Erica, to put that into the fore of reproductive health. And that, so rather than something to be mental health, something we think about when we don't have it anymore, when we're burned out, then we're like, oh, you know, I need to pay attention to it. It's something just like, you know, we're supposed to take care of our physical bodies by how we eat and exercise. And these things are good for mental health too. We could think about sort of reconceptualize mental health so that it's something that we are all aiming to sustain. To sustain, just like we sustain our physical health. That would go a long way. I think, you know, not just for our individual well-being, but even for sustaining these longer term, all the social change that needs to happen.
Completely.
Yeah.
Karestan, is there, like, just to close this out, like, because I that's so important. And I had heard you say something earlier where you were like, oh, I throw myself into everything, and then, like, I have to just, like, completely unplug to recharge. That's what I do. I'll literally, I'm like an all-in person. So I'll be like all in, until all of a sudden I realize, like, oh my God, I'm all in. And like, I'm like freaking out because I don't have anything else to give to myself or to anybody else. So then I just unplug and like fall apart for like a minute and then find ways to recharge, rather than that being so like extreme. Like, is there, I'm asking for myself and a friend. Anything that you can suggest? Cause I think it's important.
So yeah, and I am, this is like a do what I say, not what I do moment. My teenage son would remind me of this, but, so a couple really basic things is, one set of things is super boring and no one wants to hear them, but all these really basic things about like getting up the same time, keeping a schedule, eating regularly at certain times a day and trying to get some exercise. And we're all in different stages of like quarantine, ideally outside, but if you can't, all those things will help with your mental health and well-being, and are all important. And really boring things that I know, like, you know, sound simple. And then the other piece is I think we all need to make time, and I'm not good at this, but to get away from, before we burn out, to get away from all the stuff that's going on out there. So if it's turning off it's gonna be ironic to have this on social media and I'm saying turn off your social media or your news, whatever, you know, your email, or, and just give yourself little breaks from that. That is so important. Even if it's to listen to music, even if it's to sit in silence, doing that regularly. And whether it's, you know, and maybe if you live with other people or you have a friend, maybe agreeing to do it together, like, oh, you're both going to do that at this time of day, or you're, you know, as a family, you're going to turn things off at a certain time. I think that those things are really critically important, and things that, you know, all of us can do, because all the work that needs to be done will still be there, you know, in 2 hours or in 8 hours or in 12 hours. It's not going to be, it's not like things are all going to get resolved while you took your little break. And you'll come back and you may feel a little bit more refreshed and able to face things again. Because otherwise it can be, you know, all the stuff going on there can be quite overwhelming.
Yeah.
Well,
super helpful. Erica, anything to add?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we covered most of the things that feel really helpful. I feel there's like a lot here, and in trying to keep with our feeling of not overdoing it, I feel like
Yeah.
kind of, like pause and just kind of let all those different pieces start to float together to something that makes sense, or into something that makes sense.
I know, I feel like we could all have like a 10-part series.
We could, I know. I could keep talking to you, for you ladies, for another, 3 hours, but then, right, we'd all need to pass out, so.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you both, because I honestly, like, in sort of keeping with the theme, I felt pretty vulnerable actually
Yeah.
doing this. And I just really want to thank you for, holding the space and to really, dive into some critical issues and with such, beautiful sort of personal reflection. And I think vulnerability always takes courage. And I just see it in both of you. And it brings me so much like hope, to the world, and to me. So thank you so much for the contribution.